Inside the barn, the air was cool and dim, filled with the earthy scent of hay and leather. Javier stood by the workbench, his calloused hands gripping the edges as he replayed the scene in his mind. He had spent years building Whispering Winds Ranch into a sanctuary, a place where abused and neglected horses like Blaze could heal and thrive. To see such cruelty inflicted on one of his horses stirred something deep within him, not just anger, but resolve. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Claire," he said when the line picked up. "Javier," came the voice of Officer Claire Hammond, the local deputy and an old friend. "What's going on?" "We've got a problem. Some punk in a black sports car just threw a rock at Blaze. He hurt him for no reason, Claire, just for fun." There was a pause on the other end, and then Claire's voice hardened. "Did you get a plate number?" "Sure did," Javier replied, his tone grim. "He's got one of those vanity plates. Easy to spot." "Text it to me," Claire said. "I'll look into it. But Javier, don't do." The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the serene countryside. Whispering Winds Ranch stretched across the rolling meadows, its white fences gleaming in the fading light. Horses of every color grazed peacefully in the open fields, their gentle movements a harmonious rhythm against the quiet backdrop of rustling leaves and distant bird songs. Among them was Blaze, a chestnut Mustang with a white blaze streaking down his face, his powerful frame and flowing mane embodying both elegance and resilience. He was the pride of the ranch, a living symbol of second chances, having been rescued from a life of cruelty and given a new purpose. Javier, the ranch's owner, stood leaning against a weathered wooden fence, his hat tilted to shield his face from the setting sun. A retired equestrian, his once strong hands now bore the calluses of a simpler but deeply fulfilling life. This sanctuary was his life's work, a refuge for horses who had suffered at the hands of those who saw them as little more than tools. To Javier, each horse was more than just an animal. They were survivors, each with a story worth telling. The peace of the evening was suddenly shattered by the distant growl of an engine. Javier's eyes narrowed as he turned toward the horizon, the sound growing louder and more menacing. A black sports car tore through the gravel road leading to the ranch, its sleek body gleaming like a predator on the hunt. Behind the wheel was Brandon, a young man with too much money, too much arrogance, and far too little respect for anything but himself. His sunglasses glinted in the sun as he pulled the car to an abrupt stop near the fence, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled like a stain on the pristine surroundings. Brandon stepped out of the car with an air of defiance, his smirk as sharp as the engine's roar. He took in the scene before him with a sneer, his gaze landing on Blaze, who grazed peacefully by the fence. The Mustang lifted his head, his dark, intelligent eyes meeting Brandon's for a brief moment. There was something almost regal in the way Blaze held himself, a quiet dignity that made him stand apart from the others. But Brandon didn't see dignity. He didn't see resilience. All he saw was an opportunity for amusement. Without hesitation, Brandon picked up a rock from the roadside, testing its weight in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled it at Blaze, the cruel smirk on his face widening as it struck the horse's flank. Blaze reared in pain and shock, the sudden movement scattering the other horses in the field. Brandon's laughter echoed across the fields, a harsh and hollow sound that seemed to taint the very air. But what he didn't realize, what his arrogance blinded him to, was that he wasn't alone. From the shadows of the barn, Javier watched everything, his steady gaze fixed on the man who had dared to harm one of his own. Quiet fury burned in his chest, but he didn't move. Not yet. Justice, after all, doesn't need to rush. It waits for the perfect moment to strike. The laughter faded into the distance as Brandon casually strolled back to his car, oblivious to the impact of his cruel act. Blaze, The chestnut Mustang stood frozen for a moment, his powerful body trembling as the pain lingered. His large, intelligent eyes darted around, confused and wary, before his ears flicked toward the barn, where a familiar figure emerged. Javier, his boots crunching softly against the gravel, approached Blaze with measured steps, his calm demeanor masking the fire burning inside him. "Easy, boy," Javier whispered, his voice steady and soothing. He reached Blaze and rested a reassuring hand on the horse's muscular neck, running his fingers gently along the spot where the rock had struck. Blaze flinched slightly at the touch, but soon relaxed under Javier's calming presence. But Javier knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Inside the barn, the air was cool and dim, filled with the earthy scent of hay and leather. Javier stood by the workbench, his calloused hands gripping the edges as he replayed the scene in his mind. He had spent years building Whispering Winds Ranch into a sanctuary, a place where abused and neglected horses like Blaze could heal and thrive. To see such cruelty inflicted on one of his horses stirred something deep within him, not just anger, but resolve. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Claire," he said when the line picked up. "Javier," came the voice of Officer Claire Hammond, the local deputy and an old friend. "What's going on?" "We've got a problem. Some punk in a black sports car just threw a rock at Blaze. He hurt him for no reason, Claire. Just for fun." There was a pause on the other end, and then Claire's voice hardened. "Did you get a plate number?" "Sure did," Javier replied, his tone grim. "He's got one of those vanity plates, easy to spot." "Text it to me," Claire said. "I'll look into it. But Javier, don't do anything rash. Let me handle it." Javier let out a quiet sigh. "You know me, Claire. I'll play this smart. But I'm not letting this slide." "I wouldn't expect you to," she replied. "Send me the details, and I'll be in touch." By the time Javier hung up, he had already begun to piece together a plan. He knew people in the community, farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk, who would recognize the car or its owner. It didn't take long for word to spread. Within hours, Javier learned the driver's name, Brandon Lewis, a trust fund kid with a penchant for trouble. Brandon had a reputation for recklessness and entitlement, and this wasn't his first run-in with the locals. Javier's jaw tightened as he listened to the stories. Brandon had sped through school zones, disrupted farmers' markets with his blaring music, and even been caught vandalizing public property. But his wealthy family had always bailed him out, ensuring he never faced real consequences. Not this time, Javier thought. Not if I can help it. The next morning, Javier met Claire at the local diner. Over steaming cups of coffee, they discussed the situation. "Brandon's got a long list of complaints against him," Claire said, flipping through a small notepad. "But nothing ever sticks. His family's lawyers make sure of that." Javier's eyes darkened. "He's not just endangering people now. He's hurting animals. That's a different kind of cruelty." Claire nodded. "Agreed. Here's what I'm thinking. We bring him in for a conversation. Nothing formal yet. Just let him know we're watching." Javier's lips curled into a small, determined smile. "And I'll make sure he knows exactly what's at stake." A few days later, Brandon's car screeched to a stop outside the sheriff's office, his usual arrogance on full display. Claire had summoned him under the pretext of a traffic violation, knowing it would be the only way to get him to show up. Inside, Javier waited. He stood by the window, his weathered face calm but unreadable. When Brandon sauntered in, his smirk faded slightly as he noticed Javier. "What's this about?" Brandon asked, his tone dismissive. Claire gestured toward Javier. "He has something to say to you." Javier stepped forward, his piercing gaze locking onto Brandon's. "You hurt one of my horses," he said, his voice low and steady. "You threw a rock at Blaze. For fun." Brandon rolled his eyes. "It's just a horse. What's the big deal?" Javier's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. He's not just a horse. He's a living being, one who's suffered enough already. And what you did was cruel. Brandon shrugged. So what? Are you going to sue me? Javier stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Brandon's. I don't need to sue you, but you're going to make this right. Starting now. Brandon's smirk returned, though it faltered slightly under Javier's intense stare. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Claire interjected. You've got two choices, Brandon. Face charges for animal cruelty or spend the next 2 weeks at Whispering Winds Ranch, under Javier's watch. Brandon's face twisted in disbelief. You've got to be kidding me. Nope, Claire said firmly. Pick one. The following morning, Brandon arrived at the ranch, clearly out of his element. His designer boots and crisp jacket stood in stark contrast to the rugged, practical attire of Javier and the ranch hands. Lose the boots, Javier said flatly, handing Brandon a pair of worn work boots. And get ready to work. Brandon muttered under his breath but complied, his frustration evident. His first task was cleaning the stalls, a grueling, unpleasant job that had him gagging within minutes. This is disgusting, Brandon complained, holding his nose. It's called responsibility, Javier replied calmly. Something you've been avoiding for too long. As the day went on, Brandon struggled with each task, from hauling water buckets to repairing fences. The horses watched him curiously, their quiet presence unsettling him in ways he couldn't explain. By the time the sun set, Brandon was exhausted, his once pristine clothes now caked in dirt and sweat. Javier said little, letting the day's work speak for itself. Same time tomorrow, Javier said as Brandon trudged toward his car. And don't be late. On the third day, Javier assigned Brandon to care for Blaze. The Mustang had been wary of Brandon since the incident, his dark eyes watching the young man with a mix of caution and mistrust. Brandon hesitated, unsure of how to approach the horse. He remembers what you did, Javier said bluntly, but he'll give you a chance if you're patient. Brandon swallowed hard and approached Blaze slowly, extending a shaky hand. The Mustang's ears flicked back, but he didn't move away. Brandon began brushing his coat, his movements awkward at first, but gradually becoming more confident. For the first time, Brandon felt a pang of guilt. The memory of Blaze rearing in pain flashed through his mind, and he found himself whispering, "I'm sorry." Javier, watching from a distance, allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. It was a start. As the days turned into weeks, Brandon's demeanor began to shift. The entitled swagger that had once defined him faded, replaced by a quiet humility. Each morning, he arrived on time, ready to tackle the tasks Javier assigned him. Cleaning stalls, feeding the horses, mending fences, what once felt like punishment now carried a sense of purpose. Brandon developed a bond with the horses, especially Blaze. The Mustang, initially wary, grew to trust him. By the second week, Blaze would nuzzle Brandon's shoulder as he worked, a small but powerful gesture of acceptance. For Brandon, it felt like a second chance, not just with Blaze, but with himself. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Javier called Brandon over to the porch. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the horses graze. "You've come a long way," Javier finally said. "But tell me, what have you learned?" Brandon stared out at the field, his voice quiet. "I've learned they're not just animals. They're like us, in a way. They feel things, they trust us, and we owe them respect." Javier nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good start." On Brandon's last day at the ranch, Javier gave him one final task: to lead Blaze on a walk through the open pasture. Brandon, now confident in his movements, approached Blaze with the halter. The Mustang stood still, his intelligent eyes meeting Brandon's. "Hey, boy," Brandon murmured, his tone soft. He slipped the halter over Blaze's head and led him out into the field. The two moved in harmony, the tension of their first encounter replaced by an unspoken understanding. Javier watched from a distance, his arms crossed. When Brandon returned, he gave the young man a nod of approval. As Brandon prepared to leave the ranch, he turned to Javier. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for giving me a chance to make things right." Javier nodded. "It wasn't just for Blaze, it was for you too. Now go out there and prove you've changed." Brandon glanced back at Blaze one last time. The Mustang nickered softly, as if to say goodbye. Brandon smiled, his hand resting on the car door. "I will." As Brandon drove away, the ranch returned to its quiet rhythm. Javier watched the car disappear over the horizon, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. Justice had been served, not through punishment, but through transformation. If this story moved you, please like, share, and spread the message. Respect all life. Let's work together to create a kinder, more compassionate world.